The average person is said to spend 15 minutes in the bathroom. Why not take advantage of that time and learn something new? Presenting the 15-minute podcast on weird facts, crazy details, and funny particulars that you'll be able to enjoy while you're taking on your free time. Welcome to The Shit with Sam Butler. Welcome to another episode of The Shit Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Butler. I want to thank you guys for joining me on this episode 110 in English, 110th episode in English. It's great to be doing the podcast in the studio once again. This one's a little unique. It's not necessarily an article that I researched, or this episode is more personal. And if you happen to watch it in Spanish, it's episode 110 in Spanish, because I'm running the episodes like side by side so that people that are trying to learn both languages can kind of compare episodes and get the gist of what we're talking about. I didn't think about doing this early on because I thought it would be neat to have different content in each episode, whether it's English or Spanish. But then I started getting contacted by a lot of English language schools in Latin America, thanking me for the episodes in English. And then I came up with the idea, why don't we do the episode in English and then in Spanish, or vice versa, Spanish then English, so that they can use it as a teaching tool. So a big shout out to all you guys out there that are learning English, using this podcast as a learning tool. I'm happy to do it. Like I said, I speak both languages. I speak English better than Spanish, if you can believe that. But my mom was from Mexico, so I learned Spanish at a very young age. And I grew up in the U.S., going to school in the U.S. And of course, all our classes are in English. All our friends speak English. So it's one of those things that you start to lose the use of the language, and you start to develop accents, and you start to not be so conversational. Well, I started doing stand-up in Spanish, and I started working in Mexico. And so then I made a conscious effort to speak the best Spanish that I could. And it's a work in progress. So I'm not perfect in Spanish. I'm not perfect in English, as many of us that are raised in the border. But this is a good opportunity for you guys to take advantage of conversational English and Spanish. Now, getting back to the episode. If you watched the Spanish episode, you saw that I had a guest. His name was Johnny Mejia. He's a comedian in Mexico City, and I didn't have a chance to record this episode in English with him for different reasons, but I think the content was so good that it merits its own episode in English. Now, what was interesting about Johnny is that I had invited him to record the episode with me in Spanish in Mexico City, because I was down in Mexico City preparing for a show that I had. And I want to thank everyone who came to the show. It was a huge success. It was awesome to have as many people show up from a city that I'm not a part of. I didn't grow up in the comedy scene in Mexico City, so I want to thank everyone who came out. It was a great show. But Johnny was going to be my host on the show, and I wanted to kind of give him a little bit of exposure so that my audience would know who he was. Well, we did an episode on the barrel organ in Spanish. You guys just saw the last episode in English, episode 109. We talk about the barrel organ. And while we were doing that episode in conversation, I came to the realization that he actually has a very unique story. Johnny Mejia, and he's comfortable talking about it, and that's why I'm comfortable doing this episode in English. But my buddy Johnny was born in prison, which I thought was super unique. I mean, how many times do you get to meet someone that actually spent the first 3 years of their life in prison? And, when you talk about people being innocent in prison, everybody's innocent in prison. Well, this guy really was innocent in prison. I mean, he did 3 years time. Now, of course, he doesn't have a lot of recollection of that time because he was 3 years old when his mom got out. But it raised the question, what happens to kids that are born in prison? What is the system? Now, when we were talking, and the reason it came up is he had a very specific logo on his jacket, and he had that same logo on his ball cap. And I asked him, I said, well, what's the deal with the logo? If you look back at the episode in Spanish, you can see it. If you look at it on the YouTube channel, you can actually see the logo. But it looks like 4 bars, and the bars are kind of like, when you were counting, when they taught you to count in fives in elementary school, where you draw 4 lines and then you cross one. Well, that's what the logo looks like. But the cross line actually is 2 hands shaking. So it intrigued me. I asked him, and he said, well, that's a company or a nonprofit in Mexico that is called Reintegra, or Reintegrate. And it's an organization that helps prisoners reintegrate into society. But more than that, it helps the kids that were born in prison reintegrate into society as well, because they are left with traumas. Now, the question came up, okay, so how does this work? And in my conversation with Johnny, he was explaining to me that he was born in prison. He was allowed to stay with his mother up until age 3. Fortunately for him, she made parole, and he was able to continue to stay with his mother. He said in some cases, kids are allowed to stay in Mexico. They're allowed to stay with their mother up until age 6. Now you say, well, that's pretty nice, but you have to remember this is a Mexican prison. So I don't know how nice it could be in actuality. I don't think it's as bad as what we envision. A lot of the Hollywood productions, I think they do have prison institutes that are humanitarian to a certain degree. And so he still said it was what he recollects from that is a very rough beginning to life. But they discovered that when babies are born in prison, the best thing that they could do is leave them with their mother, because they build that bond. And of course, these are developmental stages in life. And so in Mexico, that is the law. One of the questions that came up in our conversation was, well, how does that work in the United States? And of course, he's not very familiar with the United States in that sense, because he was born and raised in Mexico. And so he didn't give it a second thought. But I did some research, and I came to find out that in the United States, when a baby is born in prison, usually he's taken away from his mother within the first 24 hours, sometimes 36 hours, and in some cases up to 72 hours. So that's a huge difference in the time that the mother-child bond is developed. And so that made me kind of research it a little bit more. It was a super interesting subject for me. And I just never, sometimes we rant and complain about our lot in life, and, a lot of people were born into poverty. I was not born into poverty. I was fortunate enough that my dad stuck around, and raised us. I have half brothers and sisters that weren't that fortunate, but fortunately for them, they did have a really good stepdad, and they had a decent upbringing. But that there's a lot of families that are born in poverty, a lot of kids born in poverty, and they have a rougher time making it in society just because of the social class, the social stigma, the education, their peers, the people that they grow up with. So when you start to think about those things, it kind of helps you be a little more grateful as to your lot, where you were born. I know that I'm 46 years old, and I know that at this point in my life, there's a lot of reflection over how fortunate I am versus how unfortunate I am. And I know that a lot of times when you're younger, you think life should be better, but we pretty much probably have a pretty good existence. And if you don't, then I would suggest that you figure out what you need to do to better your existence. And that applies to me too. In life. But I started to find out that in the United States, kids get to stay with their mom, usually 24 to 72 hours. That being said, there's actually some programs. One of them is in Bedford Hills, New York. And what they do is they actually have prison nurseries. And so some of these kids and some of these women who may have committed crimes and found themselves sentenced to prison while pregnant, well, they're in a real pickle here. So just because they made a mistake in one aspect of their life doesn't mean they make a mistake as far as having a child. A lot of these women could be very good caregivers. So with that being the case, you start to wonder what happens. Well, prison nurseries are unique. There's only I believe there's 26 prison nurseries in the United States. And there's something like 200,000 female prisoners, which is a huge number. Which is a huge number. But
to get here,
you see that there's an opportunity for the mother to actually stay with their child for 12 months. That's the first year, which I think is crucial for development. And in some cases, they'll allow the mother to keep the child for up to 18 months. Now, how does this work? Well, the prison has an actual nursery, and the nursery is designed to take care of. They have a daycare. Now, the labor for the daycare comes from the actual prisoners. So they'll screen a prisoner and they'll train a prisoner. And of course, they'll be observing the prisoner that works in the daycare as an assignment. And these people have been trained. And we know that that's kind of a scary thought. If you've ever had to leave your kids in daycare, to leave your kids with somebody, you never know what they could do to your kids. But in this case, I believe that the kid is being cared for and being observed by cameras and guards and so on and so forth. Now, the mother usually has a work assignment within the prison, and she's got to go and do her job to contribute to the living arrangements for everybody there. So what they normally do is they'll assign a woman to her own cell, and the baby will have to be in a crib. They're not allowed to have the babies sleep with them in their own bed. They have to put them to sleep in a crib, but they give them a little bit of privacy, which I believe is very compassionate. There's advocates for this. There's people that believe that having the baby with the mother is a good thing. I personally believe it is a good thing because I believe in the first 2 or 3 years is when the baby really develops its ability to connect, with their parents. And in some cases, if the mother's going to hit parole by 18 months, they allow the baby to go the 18 months with the mother, and then the mother gets out, and then she's got to take care of that kid after she gets out of prison. So if you can imagine how hard it is to leave prison and then go get a job, well, now she's got to do it with her kid. And the people who are against it mainly for 2 reasons. The main reason is that they're concerned about who's paying for this. It's tax dollars that pay for prisoners. So I believe the state of New York spends something like $170,000 a year in providing care for babies in the prison system. Sounds like a lot of money, but if you think about it, it's really not that much money for the state of New York to do. So I think that that's pretty cool that they do that. I understand it's taxpayer dollar, and in a fair world, they wouldn't get 1 cent of it. But in actuality, I mean, I as a parent, I think about that situation, and I think that raising decent human beings is a good thing. Now, that's the first reason that they kind of advocate against the mother having the baby. And of course, when the baby's taken away 24 hours or 72 hours, they're put into foster care. Now, foster care is okay. Of course, if the baby is up for adoption and somebody adopts it, that's even better. But the thought process is, if this baby is born in prison and is with his mother for the first year, and then or even 18 months, and the mother gets out of prison and ends up repeating her offense, then eventually that baby will be torn away from the mother. And now there's a whole other trauma that's involved with separating the baby when it's older. I can see that there's some sense in that. But that being the case, I think that it's a very, very unique segment of our population. And I was kind of shocked by what I was hearing in the other episode. And I think that it's something that we should be aware of. And I don't know how you contribute or help in these situations. I just know that it's a very realistic situation, and there's organizations like Reintegrate in Mexico that are actively trying to reintegrate these children into society. In my friend Johnny's case, he said that he grew up very lonely because he didn't have a traditional upbringing, and in actuality, he's looking for people in his age range that may have had similar experiences. He says he'd love to create a community or a group of people that can talk about this. And somehow this kid, an innocent kid that was preserved, he wasn't aborted, that his mother had the decency to preserve him alive, is looking for people that he can relate to. So if you know anybody in the 40-year-old range, 35 to 40-year-old range that may have been in prison, have them reach out through the YouTube channel or social media so we can connect. Even if it's somebody in the U.S. That speaks Spanish, or somebody in Mexico or Latin America, since that's where most of my listeners are, it would be awesome to help Johnny find some friends that have a similar upbringing. With that, I thought this was the shit. I don't know if it's totally awesome. I just think it's a reality. And if anything we can take away from this is that we can be grateful for a lot of things in life. And we don't have it as bad as we might think. With that being said, that wraps up this episode of the Shit Podcast. Thank you guys for listening. We'll be in touch. We have another episode coming up next week. And or this week, I believe we're going to be running all 3 episodes this week to get caught up. With that, that's it for this podcast, this episode. Like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell. It helps my numbers, and it helps me get funding to pay for my production costs. And with that, I want to thank you, and we'll see you guys on the next one.